The dust-laden wind carried the scent of ash and despair as Jackson Benton crested the hill overlooking what remained of Humboldt, Montana. The sight struck him like a physical blow, blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, charred remnants of homes and businesses scattered across the landscape like discarded toys. But it wasn't the destruction that caught his breath in his throat. It was the women gathered in the town square, their faces weathered but determined, waiting as if they knew he would come. It was 1873, 3 years after Jackson had ridden away from Humboldt with promises of return lingering on his lips. He'd never imagined coming back to this, a town reduced to ruins, likely the work of the notorious Stillwell gang that had been terrorizing settlements across the Montana Territory. His fingers tightened on the reins of his chestnut stallion, Copper, as his eyes swept over the scene, catching the gaze of one woman in particular. Even from this distance, he recognized her Josephine Hayes, the schoolteacher who had captured his heart before ambition had pulled him westward in search of gold and glory. "Well, Copper," he murmured, adjusting his worn Stetson, "seems like we've got work to do." He nudged his horse forward, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. His eyes, steely blue beneath the shadow of his hat, held a silent promise Humboldt would rise again. As Jackson approached, the women turned to watch his arrival. Some faces showed skepticism, others relief. Josephine stood slightly apart, her honey-brown hair pulled back from her face, her simple blue dress dusty at the hem. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet dignity he remembered, though new lines of worry etched the corners of her eyes. "Jackson Benton," she said, her voice neither welcoming nor hostile. "You're 3 years late." He dismounted, boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. "I came as soon as I heard," he replied, removing his hat. "What happened here, Josie?" "Don't call me that," she said sharply, then softened slightly. "Stillwell and his men, 3 weeks ago, they wanted tribute half our livestock, a quarter of our harvest. Mayor Wilson refused." She gestured to the devastation around them. This was their answer. An older woman stepped forward, her silver hair tucked beneath a faded bonnet. "Mayor Wilson and most of the men died defending the town. The rest fled. We're all that's left, Mr. Benton." Jackson counted quickly 17 women, ranging from barely adults to grandmothers and a handful of children peering from behind skirts. No men. His throat tightened. "And you stayed." "This is our home," Josephine said simply. "Where else would we go?" He nodded slowly, understanding their resolve. "I've been working as a hired gun for the railroad these past years. I've got savings, skills." He looked around at the ruins again, his expression hardening with determination. "If you'll have me, I'll help rebuild." "Why?" Josephine's question cut through the murmurs of the other women. "You left once. What's to stop you from leaving again when the going gets tough?" Jackson met her gaze squarely. "I was a fool to leave, Josephine. I won't make that mistake twice." There was a long pause as she studied him, searching for truth in his eyes. Finally, she nodded once, curtly. "We need all the help we can get, but don't think for 1 second that your return erases what you did." "Fair enough," he conceded. Mabel Thompson, the silver-haired woman who had spoken earlier, stepped forward. "We've been sleeping in the old gardener barn. It's the only structure that wasn't completely destroyed. There's room there if you don't mind the smell of hay and women's washing." Jackson nodded. "I've slept worse places." As the women dispersed, returning to whatever tasks occupied their days now, Josephine lingered. "Stillwell will be back," she said quietly. "He wants this land, all of it. The river makes it valuable." "Then we'll be ready for him," Jackson replied. He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry, Josephine, for leaving, for not being here when you needed me." Her eyes, the color of warm amber, met his briefly. "Words are easy, Jackson. Actions matter more." With that, she turned and walked away, her back straight and unyielding. Jackson watched her go, feeling the weight of his past mistakes. He'd left Humboldt chasing dreams of fortune, leaving behind a woman who'd offered him her heart and a community that had welcomed him. Now, standing amid the ashes of that community, he vowed silently that he would make amends not just with words, but with every drop of sweat and blood necessary to rebuild what was lost. The first night in Humboldt, Jackson lay awake on a thin pallet in the corner of the Gardner barn, listening to the soft breathing of the women and children who had made this space their temporary home. The barn was partitioned with hanging sheets for privacy, but the sounds of occasional weeping penetrated the makeshift walls. His heart ached at the suffering these people had endured. At dawn, he rose quietly and slipped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. He surveyed the town again in the soft light of early morning. The main street had once boasted a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, the schoolhouse, and a dozen other businesses. Now, only charred foundations remained, with the exception of the Gardner barn and the stone foundation of the town bank. It looks worse in the daylight, doesn't it? Jackson turned to find Josephine standing a few feet away, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. "I was just thinking where to start," he replied. She gestured toward what had been the center of town. "The well is still intact. We need to build a proper shelter around it first, then the smithy will need tools for everything else." Jackson nodded, impressed by her practical approach. "You've been planning." "Someone had to," she said simply. "Most of us couldn't leave even if we wanted to. We've nowhere to go, no money to start over elsewhere. And you," he asked, "you're educated, you could teach in any town." A flash of something pride, perhaps, or stubbornness crossed her face. "This is my home, Jackson. These people are my family. I don't abandon family." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. He had abandoned them, abandoned her. Fair point, he conceded. "Well, let's get started with that well house." Throughout the day, Jackson worked alongside the women, clearing debris and salvaging what materials they could use. To his surprise, they worked with efficiency and strength born of necessity. Josephine organized them into teams, some gathering usable lumber from the ruins, others preparing meals, still others caring for the few livestock that had survived the attack. By midday, they had cleared enough space around the well to begin construction of a simple shelter. Jackson, working with two younger women's sisters named Emma and Rebecca Johnson, was impressed by their knowledge of carpentry. "Our pa was the town carpenter," Emma explained as she competently measured and marked a length of salvaged timber. "He made sure we knew our way around tools." "Where is your father now?" Jackson asked, then immediately regretted the question as both sisters' faces fell. "He died defending the general store," Rebecca answered quietly. "Ma too." Jackson worked silently for a moment, respecting their grief. "He'd be proud of you," he finally said. "Both of you?" By evening, a basic structure stood around the well, nothing fancy, but enough to provide shelter from the elements while drawing water. It was a small victory, but the women gathered around it with evident pride. "It's a start," Mabel Thompson said, her weathered hand resting on the rough-hewn post. "A small one, but a start nonetheless." That night, as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew courtesy of traps Jackson had set that morning, the mood was cautiously optimistic. The women spoke of what businesses they hoped to resurrect first, what crops might still be planted before winter set in. "We need to rebuild the smithy next," Jackson suggested. "The forge survived, and with proper tools we can make faster progress on everything else." "And the schoolhouse," Josephine added firmly. "The children need routine normality." Jackson glanced at the handful of children ranging from toddlers to young teens. Their faces were too solemn for their years, marked by the trauma they'd witnessed. "You're right," he agreed. "Education shouldn't wait for convenience." After dinner, as the others settled in for the night, Josephine approached Jackson where he sat outside, keeping watch. "Why did you really come back?" she asked without preamble. Jackson was silent for a long moment, considering his answer. "I heard about the attack from a trader in Fort Benton. He said Humboldt had been destroyed, everyone killed or scattered." He looked up at her. "I had to see for myself. And if it had been true, if there had been nothing left," he shrugged. "Then I would have buried the dead and moved on, I suppose." "Just like that?" "No," he admitted. "Not just like that. I've been carrying the weight of leaving for 3 years, Josephine. Every mile I put between us felt wrong, but pride kept me going, pride and foolish dreams." She sat beside him, careful to maintain distance between them. "Did you find it, your fortune?" A bitter laugh escaped him. Enough gold dust to keep me in whiskey and regrets, nothing worth what I left behind. They sat in silence for a while, the night sounds of crickets and distant wolf calls filling the space between them. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Jackson finally said. "I don't deserve it, but I am asking for a chance to make things right for the town, for everyone here. And for us." Josephine's voice was barely audible. Jackson looked at her profile in the moonlight, remembering the softness of her lips, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. "That's not for me to ask," he said quietly, "but I never stopped loving you, Josie, not for a single day." She stood abruptly. "It's late. We have much to do tomorrow." Without another word, she walked back to the barn, leaving Jackson alone with the stars and the weight of words unspoken. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, a wagon train of 3 families heading west to Oregon. They were wary at first, seeing the destroyed town, but Jackson and Josephine explained their situation. "We can pay for supplies," Jackson offered, "and there's good grazing for your animals if you want to rest here a few days." The leader of the group, a barrel-chested man named George Miller, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "We're well supplied and making good time, but I don't feel right leaving you folks in such straits." He conferred briefly with the other men before turning back. "We can spare a few days. Got 2 good carpenters among us, and we're all handy with tools." The unexpected help was a godsend. With the additional manpower and supplies from the wagon train, they made rapid progress on rebuilding the smithy. By the end of the 3rd day, a functional forge stood where once there had been only charred earth. As the travelers prepared to depart on the 4th morning, George Miller's wife Sarah approached Josephine with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Seeds," she explained, "from my own garden back east. It's late in the season, but you might get some quick crops in before the first frost." Josephine accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. "This means more than I can say." As the wagons rolled away, Jackson stood beside Josephine, watching them disappear over the hill. "Good people," he remarked. "Yes," she agreed, "there are still some in the world." Their fingers brushed accidentally as they turned back toward town, and for a moment neither pulled away. Then Josephine straightened her shoulders and strode purposefully toward the newly constructed smithy, where the blacksmith's widow, Clara Blackwell, was already stoking the forge. Clara had been apprenticed to her husband before their marriage and knew the trade well enough to continue it. With the forge operational, they could repair tools and cast simple metal implements needed for construction. The next priority was shelter more substantial than the barn. Using the salvaged materials and fresh-cut timber from the nearby forest, they began constructing a long, single-story building divided into rooms, a bunkhouse of sorts, that would house them through the coming winter. Jackson worked from dawn until dusk each day, pushing his body to exhaustion. It was partly to prove his commitment, partly to atone for his absence, but mostly to keep his mind occupied with something other than Josephine. She worked just as hard, teaching the children in the mornings, then joining the construction efforts in the afternoons, her capable hands never idle. 2 weeks after Jackson's return, as he was setting roof beams on the bunkhouse, a lookout shouted a warning. Riders were approaching from the east, 5 men on horseback, moving with purpose. Jackson immediately climbed down, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against a sawhorse. "Get the children inside the barn," he instructed Emma, who nodded and quickly gathered the little ones. The other women took up strategic positions, arms at the ready. Jackson was impressed but not surprised they'd survived the initial attack after all. They knew how to defend themselves. As the riders drew closer, Jackson recognized the lead man, not Stillwell himself, but his right-hand man, a cruel-faced individual known only as Pearson. "That's close enough," Jackson called when the riders were within earshot. "State your business." Pearson reined in his horse, eyeing the half-constructed buildings with evident surprise. Well, looks like some rats survived the fire." His gaze settled on Jackson. "Don't know you. Name's Benton. I'm a friend of Humboldt." Pearson smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Humboldt doesn't exist anymore, friend. This land belongs to Mr. Stillwell now, by right of conquest, you might say." Jackson kept his rifle ready but not aimed directly at the men. That's not how property rights work in Montana Territory, and you know it. These people have deeds to their land. Deeds burn, Pearson replied with a shrug, just like people. From the corner of his eye, Jackson saw Josephine step forward, a shotgun held confidently in her hands. Our deeds are filed with the territorial government in Helena, she said clearly. As are the reports of your attacks on this and other settlements. Pearson's expression darkened. Mr. Stillwell is offering you all one chance to leave peacefully. Take what you can carry and go, otherwise. He left the threat hanging. Otherwise what? Jackson challenged. You burned the town once. We're rebuilding. Burn it again, we'll rebuild again. How many men are you willing to lose in the effort? This gave Pearson pause. He glanced around, noting for the first time that several women had rifles trained on his group from various vantage points. This isn't over, he said finally. Mr. Stillwell wants this land, and what Mr. Stillwell wants, he gets, one way or another. Tell Stillwell if he wants to talk terms, he can come himself, Jackson replied. Unarmed and respectful, Pearson spat on the ground. Mr. Stillwell doesn't negotiate with squatters. Then we have nothing more to discuss, Jackson said firmly. Ride out now while you still can. For a tense moment, it seemed Pearson might order an attack. Then, with a curt nod to his men, he wheeled his horse around. 2 weeks, he called over his shoulder. That's how long you've got before we return, and we won't be coming to talk. They watched the riders disappear over the ridge before lowering their weapons. Jackson turned to find Josephine staring after them, her expression grim. We need to prepare, she said simply. Jackson nodded. We need more men. There's no time to recruit, Mabel pointed out, not with only 2 weeks. Then we'll make do with what we have, Josephine said resolutely. We'll fortify what buildings we have, set traps along the likely approaches, and I'll ride to Fort Benton, Jackson interrupted. The army won't intervene in what they see as a private dispute, but I know men there, good men who owe me favors. I might be able to bring back help. Josephine considered this. How long would you be gone? 4 days each way if I push hard. That leaves time to gather men and return before Stillwell's deadline. The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Josephine nodded. Go then. But Jackson, she stepped closer, her voice lowering, if you don't return this time. He met her gaze steadily. I will return, Josie, I swear it on my life. She held his gaze for a long moment before nodding once. Take enough provisions for the journey, we can spare them. Jackson departed at dawn the next morning, riding copper hard toward Fort Benton. The journey was arduous, through terrain alternating between dense forest and open prairie, but he pushed on relentlessly, stopping only when absolutely necessary for copper's sake. He arrived at Fort Benton on the evening of the 4th day, exhausted but determined. The fort was a bustling trading post on the Missouri River, frequented by trappers, traders, and frontiersmen of all kinds. Jackson headed straight for the Broken Spur Saloon, where he knew he would find at least some of the men he sought. The saloon was crowded and noisy, filled with the smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Jackson pushed his way to the bar, ordering a whiskey and scanning the room. It didn't take long to spot a familiar face, Daniel "Red" Collins, a former cavalry scout turned bounty hunter with whom Jackson had worked several times in the past. Red recognized him immediately, raising his glass in greeting. Benton, thought you'd gone to strike it rich in the goldfields. Plans change, Jackson replied, making his way to Red's table. I need your help and I can pay. Red's eyebrows rose. Must be serious if you're offering money up front. What's the job? Jackson explained the situation in Humboldt, the attack, the rebuilding efforts, and Stillwell's threat to return. I need men, he concluded. Good men who can handle themselves in a fight. Red whistled low. Stillwell's got a reputation and it ain't pretty. They say he's got 30 men riding with him, all killers. Probably an exaggeration, Jackson said, but even if it's half that, we're outnumbered and outgunned unless I can bring back help. Red considered for a moment, then nodded. I'm in. Not for the money, though I'll take it, but because Stillwell's been asking for someone to put him down for years. He glanced around the saloon. I can think of 5, maybe 6 men here who might join up. Let me talk to them. By midnight, Red had recruited 4 additional men, a former Texas Ranger named Hollies, 2 brothers who'd worked as cattle drivers, and a quiet, deadly man known only as Finn, who had his own score to settle with Stillwell's gang. "It's not an army," Red admitted as they finalized their plans, "but it's better than nothing." "We leave at dawn," Jackson told them. "I can pay each of you $50 now, another $50 when the job's done." "If we're still breathing," Hollies remarked dryly. Jackson didn't deny the risk. "Those women have shown more courage than most men I know. They deserve the chance to keep their homes." The men nodded in agreement. Whatever their personal motivations, money, revenge, or simple decency, they were committed to the cause. As promised, they departed at first light, a small but formidable force riding hard for Humboldt. Jackson pushed the pace, acutely aware of each passing hour. They made better time than he had on the journey out, arriving in Humboldt late on the 8th day after his departure. The sight that greeted him filled Jackson with both pride and concern. In his absence, the women had been busy. The bunkhouse was complete with a sturdy roof and walls. Around the perimeter of the central buildings, they had constructed a rough palisade of sharpened logs set at an angle in the earth, not a proper stockade, but an effective deterrent to mounted attackers. Josephine emerged from the bunkhouse as they rode in, her face showing momentary relief before settling back into determined lines. "You came back," she said simply. "I said I would," Jackson replied, dismounting. He gestured to the men behind him. "This is Red, Hollies, the Tanner brothers Sam and Joe and Finn. They're good men, all of them." Josephine nodded in acknowledgement. "We're grateful for your help, gentlemen. We can offer food and shelter, but not much else until this is over." Jackson explained the situation, Red assured her. "We know what we're getting into." Mabel Thompson appeared beside Josephine, wiping her hands on her apron. "There's stew and bread inside. You must be hungry after your journey." As they ate, Jackson was introduced to several innovations the women had implemented in his absence. Clara, the blacksmith's widow, had crafted rudimentary but effective caltrops, 4 pointed metal spikes designed to cripple horses, which they had scattered along the most likely approach routes. Emma and Rebecca Johnson had designed a system of trip wires connected to warning bells salvaged from the ruins of the church. "We've been practicing our shooting too," Josephine added. "Every woman here can handle a rifle or shotgun." Jackson nodded approvingly. "You've done well, better than I expected." "We've had plenty of motivation," she replied dryly. "Stillwell's men have been watching from the ridge every day, never approaching, just observing." This news troubled Jackson. "They're assessing our defenses, planning their attack." "That's what we figured," Josephine agreed. "We have 4 days remaining before their deadline." The next morning, Jackson and Red rode out to survey the surrounding area, identifying potential ambush points and escape routes should they become necessary. The land around Humboldt offered both challenges and opportunities for defense. The town itself sat in a small valley, with approaches from the east and west, while dense forest provided cover to the north and the river bordered the south. "If they come in force, they'll come from the east," Red predicted. "It's the most direct route from Stillwell's ranch and the terrain's better for horses." Jackson agreed. "We should focus our defenses there but be prepared for them to split their forces." Upon their return, they gathered everyone in the partially rebuilt town square to discuss strategy. Jackson was impressed by how quickly the men he'd brought integrated with the women of Humboldt. There was no condescension, no questioning of the women's abilities. They had all seen too much of the frontier's harsh realities to cling to such prejudices. "We're outnumbered," Jackson stated bluntly. "But we have advantages. We know the terrain, we have prepared defenses, and we're fighting for our homes. That counts for something." "For everything," Josephine corrected quietly. The next 3 days were spent in intensive preparation. Additional defensive measures were constructed. Ammunition was counted and distributed. Escape routes were established for the children and elderly should the worst occur. Throughout it all, Josephine worked tirelessly, her determination never wavering. On the evening before Stillwell's deadline, Jackson found her alone by the well, drawing water in the fading light. "You should rest," he suggested. "Tomorrow will be difficult." She straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll rest when we're safe." Jackson stepped closer, taking the water bucket from her hands. "Josie," he said softly, "I need to say something in case things don't go well tomorrow." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm listening." "I was wrong to leave 3 years ago. I thought I needed to make my fortune to be worthy of you, but I understand now that was just pride and foolishness. The truth is, I've never felt whole without you, not for a single day." Josephine's expression softened slightly. "Jackson, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I don't expect forgiveness or for things to go back to how they were. I just need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, coming back to Humboldt, coming back to you is the best decision I've ever made." For a long moment, she was silent. Then, with a barely perceptible tremble in her voice, she said, "I never stopped loving you either. I was angry, I still am, sometimes, but my heart never changed." Jackson reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he caressed her cheek with calloused fingers. "When this is over," he promised, "if we survive tomorrow, I'm never leaving again. If you'll have me, I'll spend every day proving that to you." Instead of responding with words, Josephine closed the distance between them. Her lips met his in a kiss that spoke of years of longing, of anger transformed into something deeper. When they finally parted, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "Come back to me tomorrow," she whispered. "That's all I ask. I will," he vowed. "Nothing could keep me away." Dawn broke clear and cool on the day of Stillwell's deadline. Everyone was in position before first light, the men Jackson had brought, along with the women of Humboldt, stationed at strategic points around the settlement. The children and 3 elderly women were hidden in a root cellar beneath the ruins of the general store, with provisions and instructions to flee to the forest if the battle went poorly. Hours passed with no sign of Stillwell's gang. The sun climbed higher, casting short shadows across the newly constructed buildings. The tension was palpable, every creak and rustle causing hands to tighten on weapons. "Maybe they're not coming," Emma Johnson suggested hopefully around midday. Red shook his head. "They're coming." Stillwell's not the type to make empty threats. As if summoned by his words, a plume of dust appeared on the eastern horizon. Jackson, watching from his position atop the bunkhouse, counted at least 20 riders approaching at a steady pace. "Here they come," he called down to the others. "Remember the plan, let them get close before you reveal yourselves. Make every shot count." The riders slowed as they approached the outskirts of town, clearly surprised by the progress of reconstruction. At their head rode a large man with a silver-streaked beard and cold eyes, Stillwell himself, flanked by Pearson and another lieutenant. Jackson climbed down and walked out to meet them, standing alone in the center of what had once been the main street. Behind him, the defenders remained hidden, weapons ready. Stillwell reined in his horse about 20 yards from Jackson, studying him with undisguised contempt. "You must be Benton," he said. "Pearson mentioned you." "And you're Stillwell," Jackson replied evenly. "The man who burns towns and murders innocents." Stillwell's expression didn't change. "Business," he said dismissively. "This valley has the water rights I need for my cattle operation. The people here refused a fair offer. So you decided to take it by force." "The strong survive on the frontier," Stillwell stated, as if explaining a simple fact. "I gave these people a chance to leave with their lives. That was generous." Jackson's hand rested near his holstered revolver. "I'm giving you the same chance now. Ride away. Leave Humboldt and its people in peace." A ripple of laughter ran through Stillwell's men. Stillwell himself smiled coldly. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Benton. Look around you, this isn't even a proper town anymore, just a collection of hovels. And you think you and a bunch of women can stand against me?" "Not just women," Jackson corrected. At his signal, Red, Hollies, the Tanner brothers, and Finn emerged from their hiding places, rifles ready. Around the perimeter of the town, the women of Humboldt also revealed themselves, each armed and positioned behind cover. Stillwell's smile faded as he assessed the situation. "Impressive," he admitted, "but still not enough. I have 20 men here and more back at my ranch." "Even if you win today, you can't hold out forever." "We don't need to," Jackson replied. While I was gathering these men, I also sent telegrams to the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena. They know about your attacks, Stillwell. They know about the people you've killed. Right now, a detachment of soldiers is on its way from Fort Shaw to investigate. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Stillwell's face. You're bluffing. Am I? Jackson held his gaze steadily. Are you willing to bet your life and freedom on that? A tense silence fell. Jackson could almost see the calculations running behind Stillwell's eyes, weighing the risk against the potential reward, considering whether Jackson was telling the truth about the soldiers. Finally, Stillwell spoke. Pearson, take 5 men and circle around to the west. Johnson, you take 5 and approach from the river, the rest with me. So that's your answer, Jackson said, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. So be it. The battle erupted with shocking violence. Jackson dove for cover as Stillwell's men opened fire, bullets splintering wood where he had stood moments before. From their positions around the town, the defenders returned fire with disciplined precision. Josephine, positioned in the upper floor of the bunkhouse with a clear view of the eastern approach, picked off 2 of Stillwell's men in quick succession. Clara Blackwell and Mabel Thompson, sheltered behind the forge, laid down steady fire that prevented another group from advancing into the town proper. Red and Finn had moved to intercept the group trying to circle around to the west, their experienced marksmanship proving deadly in the open terrain. The Tanner brothers held the southern perimeter, watching for the men Stillwell had sent to approach from the river. Jackson found himself in a direct exchange with Stillwell and Pearson, who had taken cover behind an overturned wagon at the edge of town. The air was filled with the crack of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. You can't win this, Benton, Stillwell shouted between volleys. Surrender now, and I'll let the women leave alive. We both know that's a lie, Jackson called back, reloading his revolver with practiced efficiency. The battle continued for what felt like hours but was likely less than 30 minutes. Gradually, the defenders' superior positions and disciplined fire took their toll on Stillwell's gang. 5 were down, then 8, then 12. The attackers' confidence began to waver. Jackson saw his opportunity when Pearson leaned out to fire and exposed himself for a fraction too long. His shot caught Pearson in the shoulder, spinning him out from behind the wagon. Before Stillwell could pull his lieutenant back to safety, Jackson put another bullet in Pearson's leg, effectively removing him from the fight. With his right-hand man down and nearly half his force either dead or wounded, Stillwell's resolve finally broke. Fall back, he shouted to his remaining men. Fall back to the ridge. As the attackers retreated, dragging their wounded with them, a jubilant cheer rose from the defenders. Jackson remained watchful, knowing that Stillwell might regroup for another assault. But something told him the worst was over. Stillwell was a bully and an opportunist, not a man who would sacrifice himself for a cause. When the last of Stillwell's men had disappeared over the eastern ridge, Jackson moved through the town, checking on the defenders. Remarkably, none had been killed, though Hollies had taken a bullet in the arm and several others had minor injuries. They're gone, Red confirmed, returning from a brief scouting expedition. Riding hard eastward from the looks of it. They'll be back, Jackson said grimly. Unless the part about the soldiers was true, Josephine finished, joining them. Her face was smudged with gunpowder, her hair coming loose from its pins, but her eyes were bright with victory. Jackson smiled. It was. I sent those telegrams from Fort Benton. The soldiers should be here within 2 days, 3 at the most. Josephine's expression shifted to one of surprised admiration. You didn't mention that before. I wasn't certain they'd respond, he admitted, but it seems they did. Stillwell wouldn't have retreated otherwise. He must have scouts who spotted the military detachment approaching. The immediate danger passed, the town gathered to tend the wounded and assess the damage from the battle. Miraculously, most of the newly constructed buildings had survived with only minor damage. The palisade had served its purpose, preventing Stillwell's men from entering the town proper on horseback. That evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across Humboldt, Jackson found Josephine standing at the edge of town, gazing eastward where Stillwell and his men had disappeared. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked as he joined her. "With Stillwell," Jackson shook his head. "No, men like him don't give up easily, but with the territorial authorities involved now, he'll have to be more careful, and we'll be better prepared if he does return." She turned to face him. "You said we." "I did," he confirmed. "I meant what I said last night, Josie. I'm staying if you'll have me." Josephine studied his face for a long moment before a slow smile spread across her features. "I suppose Humboldt could use a lawman," she mused, "someone to keep the peace as we rebuild." "Is that a job offer?" he asked, matching her smile. "It might be." She stepped closer. "Though I should warn you, the pay is terrible, the hours are long, and the schoolteacher is notoriously difficult to please." Jackson laughed, drawing her into his arms. "I think I can handle her." "We'll see about that, Mr. Benton," she murmured before rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. The military detachment arrived 2 days later, led by a no-nonsense captain named Brooks. He took statements from everyone in Humboldt about Stillwell's attacks and promised that the territorial government would take action. "We've been hearing complaints about Stillwell for months," Captain Brooks explained. "But without witnesses willing to testify, our hands were tied. Now we have what we need to move against him." "Will it be enough?" Josephine asked. "It will," the captain assured her. "The governor is particularly interested in establishing the rule of law in this region. Stillwell's days of terrorizing settlements are over." True to his word, a week later news reached Humboldt that Stillwell had been arrested at his ranch, along with several of his men. Charges of murder, arson, and extortion had been filed against them. With the threat of Stillwell removed, Humboldt's reconstruction accelerated. The soldiers had brought supplies and offered manpower before continuing on their patrol route. Red, Hollies, and Finn decided to stay on temporarily, attracted by the opportunity to help build something meaningful. The Tanner brothers departed after accepting their payment, but promised to return with supplies from Helena. As autumn progressed into winter, Humboldt gradually rose from its ashes. The general store was rebuilt, followed by the saloon, which doubled as a community gathering place. Jackson oversaw the construction of a proper jailhouse and sheriff's office, having accepted the town's official offer to serve as lawman. Most importantly, they rebuilt the schoolhouse, a project that Josephine supervised with particular care. By the time the first snow fell, the children of Humboldt were once again receiving their education in a proper building rather than the corner of the barn on Christmas Eve. 6 months after Jackson's return to Humboldt, the entire town gathered in the newly completed church for a celebration. The simple building was decorated with pine boughs and hand-dipped candles, filling the space with fragrant light. After the singing and the sharing of what modest gifts they could provide, Jackson asked for everyone's attention. The room quieted as he made his way to the front, where Josephine sat beside Mabel Thompson. "I wasn't here when Humboldt faced its darkest hour," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I can never make up for that absence. But these past 6 months have shown me what true strength and community look like." He gestured around the room. "You all welcomed me back, gave me a second chance I probably didn't deserve." His gaze settled on Josephine, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Especially you, Josie. You taught me that home isn't a place, it's the people who stand beside you through the worst of times." Jackson reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the candlelight, a simple gold ring. "I had this made from the little gold dust I brought back with me. It's not fancy, but it's honest, like the promise I want to make." He knelt before her. "Josephine Hayes, will you marry me?" A hush fell over the gathered townspeople. Josephine looked from the ring to Jackson's face, her expression softening. "You left once," she reminded him, though there was no anger in her voice now, "and I came back," he replied. "I'll always come back to you, Josie, for the rest of my days." A smile bloomed across her face, radiant in the candlelight. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Benton." The church erupted in cheers and applause as Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tender kiss. They were married on New Year's Day, 1874, in the same church, with the entire population of Humboldt in attendance. Red served as Jackson's best man, while Emma Johnson stood as Josephine's maid of honor. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, a testament to the community's resilience and capacity for joy even after enduring so much hardship. Spring brought new beginnings to Humboldt. The fields were planted with crops, new businesses opened, and construction continued on homes and public buildings. Word of the town's revival spread, attracting new settlers' families looking for a fresh start, craftsmen seeking opportunity, even a young doctor and his wife. On a warm evening in May, as Jackson and Josephine sat on the porch of the small house they had built together, he reflected on how far they had come. "Remember when I first rode back into town?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Everything in ruins, just you women standing defiant among the ashes." Josephine nodded, leaning into his embrace. "I remember thinking you looked exactly the same, yet completely different, older in the eyes." "I was different," he acknowledged. 3 years of chasing fool's gold will do that to a man." He gazed out at the town, the newly painted buildings, the cultivated fields beyond, the children playing in the schoolyard. "I never imagined Humboldt would come back stronger than before." "I did," Josephine said confidently. "Even on the worst days, I knew we would rebuild. We just needed help." She turned to look up at him. "We needed you, though I was too stubborn to admit it at first." Jackson kissed her forehead gently. "You would have managed without me. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Josie." She smiled at that. "Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to." Her hand drifted to her abdomen where the first subtle swell of pregnancy was just becoming visible. Especially now, Jackson's eyes followed the movement, his expression softening with wonder and love. They had discovered the pregnancy 2 months earlier, and the news had spread through Humboldt like wildfire, celebrated as yet another sign of the town's rebirth. "Boy or girl, this child will know the story of Humboldt," he promised. How a community of brave women refused to surrender their home, how they rebuilt from ashes when everyone else had given up. "And how a wandering cowboy came back just when he was needed most," Josephine added, squeezing his hand, "even if he was 3 years late." Jackson laughed, the sound mingling with the evening chorus of crickets and distant cattle. "Better late than never, Mrs. Benton." "Much better," she agreed, lifting her face for his kiss. As the sun set over the reborn town of Humboldt, casting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Jackson and Josephine remained on their porch, hands intertwined, hearts full. The ruins were gone now, replaced by new buildings and new hope. The women who had once waited in desperate defiance were now the backbone of a thriving community. And Jackson, the cowboy who had returned to make amends, had found something far more valuable than any gold mine could offer. He had found his way home. 5 years later, Humboldt had grown into a prosperous town of nearly 500 souls. The single main street had expanded to 3, with businesses ranging from the essential the general store, blacksmith, and doctor's office to the comforts of civilization, a proper restaurant, a millinery, even a small theater for traveling shows. Jackson and Josephine lived in a handsome 2-story house near the school where she continued to teach the town's children. Their family had grown to include 3 children, 4-year-old Thomas, 2-year-old Sarah, and infant Robert, named for Josephine's father. On the 5th anniversary of the battle against Stillwell, the town gathered for what had become an annual celebration of their survival and rebirth. Tables laden with food filled the town square, music played from a newly constructed bandstand, and children darted between the adults, playing games and enjoying rare treats like peppermint sticks and ice cream. Jackson, now serving his 2nd term as elected sheriff, stood at the edge of the gathering, watching with satisfaction as his fellow townspeople celebrated. Stillwell remained in territorial prison, his empire dismantled, his threats nothing but a fading memory. "Penny for your thoughts, Sheriff," came a familiar voice. Jackson turned to find Josephine beside him, little Robert nestled in her arms. She had maintained her beauty through the years, though motherhood and responsibility had added new lines of character to her face. "Just thinking how lucky I am," he replied, slipping an arm around her waist. "How lucky we all are." Josephine followed his gaze across the town square, where the original survivors of Stillwell's attack mingled with newcomers who had arrived in the years since. Mabel Thompson, now in her 70s, sat in a place of honor, surrounded by children eager to hear her stories of the old days. Clara Blackwell had remarried last year to the town's new saddler. Emma and Rebecca Johnson ran a successful dressmaking shop on the main street. "We built something special here," Josephine observed. "Something that will last." "We did," Jackson agreed. He thought back to that day when he had crested the hill and seen the ruins of Humboldt, the women waiting with determination in their eyes. "Though if I recall correctly, you were doing a fine job of rebuilding before I arrived." Josephine laughed, the sound as sweet to him now as it had been when they were younger. "Perhaps, but I'm glad you came back when you did." She reached up to touch his face, her expression growing serious. "Do you ever regret it, giving up the life of adventure for?" She gestured at their surroundings, all this responsibility. Jackson covered her hand with his own. "Not for a single moment," he said truthfully. "I was lost before I returned to Humboldt to you. Chasing dreams that turned to dust in my hands." He looked out at their town, their children playing nearby, the life they had built together. "This is the adventure that matters, Josie. Building something that will outlast us, raising our children, being part of a community that stands together through whatever comes." She smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the same love and contentment he felt. "I'm glad you see it that way. Besides," he added with a grin, "being married to you is adventure enough for any man. Jackson Benton." She swatted his arm playfully, jostling little Robert, who gurgled in protest. "Just for that, you can take this young man while I go help with the dessert table." As Jackson cradled his youngest son, watching Josephine move through the crowd with graceful purpose, he felt a profound sense of peace. The cowboy who had once seen only ruins had found redemption and renewal. His eyes had promised that Humboldt would rise again, but he had never imagined how completely that promise would be fulfilled, not just in the rebuilt town, but in the home and family he had created with the remarkable woman who had never stopped believing in second chances. And as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the valley in hues of amber and gold, Jackson Benton knew with absolute certainty that he had found his true fortune not in nuggets of precious metal, but in the golden moments of a life well lived, surrounded by those he loved in a place he was proud to call home.